I'm feeling like a million, riding around the world. I'm feeling like a dangerous lady, round and around we go. Where did I come from? Where do I go? I'm so far away from home.
Schiit Audio is a hugely popular brand, especially in the US. People in the US love buying stuff that's made in America, and Schiit is one of the few companies that's making kind of reasonably priced stuff. It's been almost impossible to get a hold of it in the EU since before COVID, so a huge thank you to Kevin from Z's Chat for sending out the Magnius and Modius. I've got a few other Schiit products at the moment, the Bifrost 2, Modi Multibits, and the Schiit Iter. Videos on all of those coming, other than the Schiit Iter, just because there's not that much to talk about. It's a nice little product though, I do like that. And I've got mixed thoughts about some of these. There's some which I really like the Bifrost 2, and then this review's going to be quite negative, and it's going to be in two parts. The first part is just going to be talking about how I found this amp, the sound of it, what my experience with it has been, and then the second part is going to be talking about the design decisions that Schiit has made, why they were effectively forced to make those design decisions, and the fact that I don't think that the reason I dislike this amp is Schiit's fault. There's timestamps on the side, so if you want to skip to a particular bit, you can do that. For now, let's talk about how it sounds. This is a powerful amp. It's 6 watts per channel, so it should power basically anything. Stuff like HD800, which is easier to power, is no trouble at all. Arias, which is what I've been judging this mostly with, is fine. Susvara needs just an insane amount of power. It can technically get them loud, but the low end is kind of loose and a bit floppy. Those need some insane amplification. So I've mostly been using the Arias. 6 watts should be plenty for basically anything other than, HE6 or Susvara. It'll probably drive 1266 fine. Although realistically, if you are getting a $200 amp for $6,000 headphones, you probably should reevaluate your chain. And the first response to that is going to be, well, it measures like God and it's got 6 watts. What more do you want? And I'll talk about that later. I'm going to talk about it in a fairly structured manner. So I'm going to talk about a couple overall sound signature things which I've found, bass, mids, treble, and then spatial presentation. So let's talk about a couple issues I have with the overall sound signature. The first is that the dynamic range feels quite compressed. This feels like a bit of a caricature of the shithouse sound. Now, people previously have said that the shithouse sound sounds compressed, and I would agree with certain products, like the Modius, for example. There's just a touch of that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's often just a flavor choice. But it's got it a lot. And so when you're listening to more delicate stuff, so for example, let's go with something from Skinny Living. They've got pretty good acoustic stuff. Only I by Skinny Living. The loud stuff sounds where it should be, and then the quieter stuff sounds like it's trying to be pushed up to meet the loud stuff, and everything ends up sounding roughly the same volume. It takes away quite a lot of the delicacy of the music.
Every day gets darker now. I'm weakened at
The snares and the strumming of everything here, even that little sort of almost like a running water type sound near the beginning, everything sounds like it's trying to push to the forefront to sound prominent. And that doesn't affect detail or anything, but what it does do is just make everything sound a little bit squashed, a little bit compressed. It makes things harder to appreciate the delicacy of. That's why orchestral music, there is stuff which is supposed to be quieter. If you look at a Hans Zimmer track or something, there's a dynamic range of 20, 30 decibels. With this, though, just everything sounds like it's trying to be loud. It's trying to be at whatever volume have set rather than where it should be in the music. So that's the first issue I found. The dynamic range does feel quite compressed. That doesn't come across on measurements, and I don't know why. I really don't know why that is. But this isn't just something that I found. Other people have found it as well. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that I don't get ear fatigue very easily. There's very few times when I do. And in fact, the arias, which are at times, a very forward headphone. They can be a touch bright, and if you put them on something which isn't mastered very well, then they'll tell you that. I can listen to these in the AHB2 all day. But then with a couple hours of listening, not even that, on this, I was feeling tired. My ears needed a break. And that was a bit of an issue for me, because it made it hard to judge this, because I kept having to take breaks. My ears felt tired, I couldn't critically listen. This is a fatiguing amp to me. I don't know how many other people are going to find that, but for me, there's just this slight graininess and lack of separation, which really gets to me, and it means that my ears feel tired after not a particularly long listening session. So let's talk about bass. This is an amp that pushes dynamics forward a little bit. It'll make certain headphones, like planars particularly, sound pretty good with a lot of stuff. That's one thing that I like that this does. Planars need power. Planars don't do too well if you put them on a lower powered amp overall, but then they also can sometimes end up sounding a little bit soft, especially when underpowered. This doesn't have any lack of power, so there's no issue there, but the added dynamic compression can actually bring a bit of a benefit. Full Control by Omnitica. This is a kind of EDM type track, and it just demonstrates punchy low-end impact quite well. The bass here is sounding very good. There's not a huge amount of texture. It doesn't present low-end timbre very well. In fact, timbre overall is not great on this amp. That'll be a bit of a recurring theme, but there's a lot of energy. It does sound quite fast. It doesn't feel lacking at all or limp. It's certainly not that. So for EDM, this is actually quite good. This sits quite well with that. It's very fast. It's very forceful. It'll drive planars with no problem. So it's good there. In the mids, that's where stuff starts to get a little bit wonky. Now, mid texture and detail is not good. It's really not good. Let's use Day by Day by Manganus Garden. This is a good track because there's a kind of wide range of instruments and guitars, as well as some vocals. And at the very end, there is a section which can really change depending on how well your chain does separation. Now, I've got it on the SGD1 for this, just because that's a good DAC for separation. In fact, all of those DACs do pretty well. Let's just go to the end of this. The vocals here are just feeling like mid-range energy. They don't feel like there's actually any texture or realism to them. In fact, there's actually two vocals overlapped, and the recording isn't great here. Doesn't matter what you put it on, it's not going to sound super separate and distinct. But then going from this to the AHB2, where is that? There we go. Immediately, there's timbre and separation, and they're a little bit more spaced. It's just a much better presentation of the vocals at that point in the music. Whereas on the Magnius, that's just all missing. There's just not much of it. It's really quite mediocre at best. Separation is not a strong point of this. Treble, let's go on to that. So treble resolution is odd. It's quite detailed at some points. There's some bits which do really well, and I've been fairly surprised. So if we go for Enough to Believe by Bob Moses. The higher pitched vocals here sound better. And the snare drums, or there's not actually a snare drum, but the kind of knocking noise in the background here, those sound pretty good. There's not actually a huge problem there. But there's this slight presence of graininess over it all. It's not that the timbre's bad. The timbre's pretty good. It's a lot better than the mid-range. I don't know why the difference between the treble and mid-range on this is so stark, but it is. It feels like the treble is a little bit detached, if I'm honest. It does quite a good job there, but then there's this graininess which really comes across somewhat aggressive on certain tracks. Take What You Want by Post Malone. If I play this, and especially the vocals at the beginning of the track, they just feel a bit dry and grainy. They're detailed, but they don't sound correct. Even though there's a ton of auto-tune going on this one, you can still tell that something's wrong. And then you switch amp again. And again, suddenly there's texture, there's timbre. It doesn't feel aggressive and in your face. It's just kind of there. And you can appreciate what they've done with the mix, and the auto-tune sounds like auto-tune rather than everything just sounding a bit wrong. So the problem I have with this is that a lot of the time it sounds very artificial. The treble is so hit or miss. Some things sound really detailed and good. Some things sound very artificial and forced and a bit aggressive. Mid-texture's not great. Low end is okay. It could be a little bit faster, but for an amp this price, it's fantastic, especially when you combine it with the power. So overall, I've not really enjoyed the sound of this amp. And I don't just mean, oh, it's not as good as the AHB2, which is 10 or 20 times its price, whatever. That's not what I mean. I mean, I don't think this is a particularly good amp at its price. Even when I just switch from something like that to the JDS Atom, so that's a single-ended amp, and in fact we're going to talk about the single-ended because that needs to be spoken about. So it's just a JDS Atom, absolutely nothing special, it's a $100 amp, and if I play the same track... Why don't you take what you want from me, take what you need from me, take what you want... And that sounds a lot better on this track. The Atom is really doing a better job than this is. It's not quite as detailed in some areas of the treble. It's not quite as resolving an amp, but it doesn't have that aggression. It doesn't have that congestion in the mids. It doesn't do planars as well because it's a lot less powerful. You're going to get a lot less low-end impact. And in fact, the Atom is a touch soft in the low end with dynamics as well. That's the only gripe I'd really have about it. L30, not so much. But the overall presentation on that amp, I prefer to this. Both of them measure excellently, so objective performance isn't really too much of a debate. But this just feels very compressed. It feels kind of forced. The single-ended output should not exist. It's just bad. You go from that to this. Why don't you take what you want from me? Take what you need from me. Take what you want to go. I never needed anything from you. The low end is soft, it's unresolving, it's kind of muddy. The low end output is really just not good compared to the balanced output or compared to other single-ended amps. I would not get this if you have single-ended headphones. If you are going to use stuff balanced, that's fine, but do not plan to use the single-ended from this. By the way, the reason that I'm using the gold point is, well, for most of the time, that's just because the gold point is going to do a better job than basically any pot, but also because the pot on this is not particularly great regardless. In fact, if I just play that again and then turn it down, I'm getting channel imbalance about there. It's shifting to the left, and it's a bit scratchy. If I pause the music and do that, now and then I can hear a little bit of static coming along. So the pot's okay, it's not great. That does a much better job. So for the most part, I've been doing volume control with that. I will, for most amp reviews, be using the gold point anyway, just because then I give the amp itself the fairest chance. But I don't like to do it all with that just because that would be unrealistic. You need to be able to be within the sort of operating range of the pot. So I need to be careful though, because a lot of the reasons I dislike this, I don't think are Schiit's fault. Let's talk about measurements. Now, measurements can absolutely tell you if something is bad. I stand by that. If something measures awfully, it's probably awful. But just because something measures good, it doesn't mean it's actually a good product. This measures great, that measures great, those two measure great, that DAC and that DAC both measure great, but they all sound different. Measurements don't tell the full story, and there's a couple problems with them. The first issue is that places like Audio Science Review don't do consistent or thorough testing. If you look at the test or review for this, they don't include intermodulation distortion, which is odd. It would be important to include that, both because IMD, intermodulation distortion, is much more audible to humans than harmonic distortion, THD, is. So for that reason alone, it should be included. It should especially be included in this case because by Schiit's own measurements, the IMD, especially on the single-ended output, is way higher than the THD. So that would, according to ASR's own metrics be the limiting factor. So it's weird that they didn't include that. I dislike the fact that Audio Science Review doesn't include the same tests for each of their products. They frequently miss out things which most people would consider important, and they tend to only include the tests which fit whatever kind of story they're wanting to tell, be it good or bad. And then the second issue is that tests at Audio Science Review don't represent music. Actual music isn't a sine wave, it's not a steady state signal. And there's a lot of different design tricks and topologies that manufacturers can employ which will make something measure really, really well, but it won't sound as good. I'll talk about that in a second, give a couple examples. A real-world example of this is nested feedback, which is not what this is using actually, but something like the Magni Heresy is using. And that's where you have lots of op-amps which have feed-forward error correction. And so for a steady state signal, a repeating sine wave, that's no problem, it'll cancel it out completely. And as soon as you throw music at it with transients and a changing waveform, it struggles. A similar kind of thing happens in the real world with active noise cancelling headphones. If you're sat on a plane or in a car, a steady state signal, something that's constant and unchanging, like an airplane engine, will just be cancelled out. It won't have any trouble at all. As soon as someone starts talking to you or someone drops something, it struggles, and then there's a problem. The same kind of thing can happen with some amp topologies. And so people are buying stuff when it measures well. Jason from Schiit Audio has spoken in a couple interviews about how when Audio Science Review started effectively trashing their lower end products, it didn't affect their high end so much, but their lower end products particularly, people stopped buying them. Their sales plummeted because people would Google for a review of a Magni or a Modi or whatever, and they would get an Audio Science review at the top. It would say, look, it doesn't measure as well, something like a topping E30 is better, you should go buy that, it's the same price. And so everyone did that, because most people don't know how to read measurements. Most people don't actually understand what they're telling you. And they don't know the context behind them. And so when someone who is just looking to buy the best product for their money, they find someone who's providing them seemingly pretty solid evidence that this is a bad product, and so they don't buy it. As a result, Schiit was forced to change how they make products. They were forced to make heretical editions of their products. Doesn't matter if they think it's good. At first, they made the Magni and the Magni Heresy. They kept both. One which measured really well, and one which they thought was designed to sound the best. But I'm guessing, given their internal sales numbers, which obviously they'll know, the Magni 3 Plus probably didn't sell very well. And so when it came to the Magnius, they didn't even bother with a discrete version anymore, because they knew it wouldn't sell. It wouldn't be worthwhile. Why do that when just screw it? If people want something that measures well, doesn't matter how it sounds, then that's what they'll get. And that's how we've ended up with the Magnius. I don't like this amp very much. I don't think it sounds great. I think it's okay. It's pretty fatiguing. It's a bit glary and aggressive at times. But it almost doesn't matter because people are going to just go by the measurements, even though the measurements don't tell the whole story. And I think that's bad, because I don't think that you can judge a product based on measurements alone. You can absolutely tell if something's bad. If something measures awfully, it's probably going to be awful. But just because something measures really well, it does not mean it's going to be a good product. And you might ask, well, how do you know it's not just placebo? How do you know you're not just imagining the difference between the Hollow May and the E30? And the answer is, well, you can prove it. And I've got a video coming which is doing just that. I've taken a bunch of different DACs, and I've done steady state measurements, like in Audio Science Review, as well as null tests with actual music, and showing what the differences are there. And the results from that have been quite interesting. So subscribe if you'd like to see that, because that explains a little bit about how measurements can be misleading. But there's stuff like the Motu M2 and the SU8 V2 from SMSL. Those sounded subjectively very similar to me. And when I nulled them, they nulled to over 100 dB, which is great. So that means they are very similar. The Hollow May and the ADI2, which again both measure excellently, or even just the ADI2 and the Motu M2, which sound different, they don't null anywhere near that much. So the fact that the nulls lined up a lot more with subjective impressions with actual music was very interesting. Subscribe if you'd like to see that video. Until then, I don't recommend the Magnius. I don't think it's a good product, but I also don't think it's Schiit's fault. I think that the reason that the Magnius was designed in this way is simply because Schiit was forced to, because people, especially in the lower cost areas, are demanding stuff that measures well, and that is the only priority. I think that's a bad thing, and I think there are better products you can buy. If you want something that sounds better, get a Asgard 3 from Schiit. That's a discrete amp. no feedback trickery involved. It doesn't measure as well, but it'll sound a lot better. Or look at non-shit products as well. There's lots of good stuff out there. In the description, there's a link to my Discord server if you'd like to come and talk to me and others there. There's also a link to my Patreon. Huge thank you to all my Patreon supporters, especially the Diamond and Legend tier supporters. Ross, Mammal, King Jong-un, and Chris. You guys are amazing. You guys are the ones that are making all this possible. Any money I get from Patreon is going into buying audio stuff to review, paying for shipping for things that viewers are sending in, because, oh my god, shipping from the US is so expensive right now. But yeah, all of it's going into making videos. I'm not using any of it for personal stuff at all. Thank you guys so much for all the support. I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a good day.